I'll never forget the day those words cut into me like a knife. My son, David, looked me straight in the eyes with a coldness I never thought I'd see in my own child, and said, "Dad, I don't need your money. I'll make my own way without you." I was 65 years old then, and I'd spent every day of my life working for him, for his future. I didn't need thanks, but that rejection shattered me. I had built an empire brick by brick, sweat dripping from my brow, nights spent awake figuring out how to keep my company alive, and days away from home just to ensure my children had what I never did. But now, in my old age, the one person I thought would understand seemed to despise everything I stood for. David was 32, ambitious, proud, and successful in his own right. Or at least, that's what he wanted the world to believe. He worked as a mid-level manager at a finance firm, dressed in expensive suits he could barely afford, and carried himself as though he had conquered the world. But I knew the truth. I knew about the credit card bills piling up, the late-night phone calls begging for extensions on rent before he finally moved back home for a while, the desperate need to impress his colleagues with things he couldn't sustain. Still, he looked at me with disdain, as though my years of hard labor meant nothing. The rift between us only grew wider when he married Claire, a sharp-tongued woman who made no secret of her dislike for me. She whispered poison into his ear at every chance. To her, I was the stubborn old man clinging to his wealth, controlling his son's life through money. In reality, I only wanted to guide him. I had nothing left to prove. But to David, under Claire's influence, I became the enemy. One evening over dinner, when the air was thick with unspoken tension, David made his declaration in front of Claire. He pushed away his plate, folded his arms, and said it loud enough to sting, "I don't need your money, Dad. I'll never depend on you." Claire smirked across the table, satisfied. My heart broke in silence. I nodded and simply said, "Very well, son." But deep inside, something changed that day. Months passed, and I began to prepare my will. I was not ill, but I knew time is never promised, and I wanted to put my affairs in order. My attorney, Mr. Hamilton, a patient man in his 70s, raised an eyebrow when I explained my wishes. I told him that the division of my estate would not be as everyone expected. For decades, my family saw me as the provider, the one whose money they could count on. But this time, I would leave behind more than wealth. I would leave behind a lesson. When the day finally came, the atmosphere was thick with greed and expectation. The family gathered in the polished office of my lawyer. My daughters, Susan and Emily, sat quietly, respectful but curious. My brother Richard was there too, an opportunist who had always hovered around me, pretending to care while secretly hoping for scraps. But the real tension radiated from David and Claire. They sat at the front, hands entwined, Claire whispering into his ear with a smile that said, "This is it. We're set for life." I wasn't there in person. By then, I had passed, and all that remained was my voice, carried through a letter Mr. Hamilton read aloud. My words filled the room, steady and deliberate. "To my beloved family, I leave behind not just the fruits of my labor, but the truth of who I am and what I value." Claire sat forward eagerly, as my lawyer detailed the distribution of assets. To my daughters, I left generous amounts, enough to secure their futures, but not so much as to rob them of ambition. They had stood by me, loved me without condition, and I wanted them to live comfortably. To my brother, I left nothing but a note, reminding him that respect is worth more than inheritance. Gasps filled the room, but Mr. Hamilton continued without pause. Finally, the moment came. David straightened in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips, waiting to hear the sum that would make him wealthy beyond measure. Mr. Hamilton read, "To my son, David Reynolds, who once told me he did not need my money, I leave exactly that, no money. Instead, I leave you the one thing I know you need more than wealth, the lesson of humility. You will inherit nothing in cash or property today. However, if within 1 year of my passing, you can prove to Mr. Hamilton that you have built something on your own, something of worth. Then, and only then, will you unlock the trust I created in your name, containing assets greater than you can imagine. The room exploded in whispers. Claire's face drained of color, her lips trembling with outrage. She hissed, "This has to be a mistake!" But David sat frozen, his arrogance crumbling as the words sank in. His face, once filled with smug confidence, now showed something he hadn't revealed in years: fear. Susan and Emily exchanged looks, but said nothing. Richard stormed out, cursing under his breath. Claire grabbed David's arm, whispering furiously, "Do something! Say something!" But there was nothing he could say. It was final. For weeks afterward, I'm told David walked around like a man possessed. The pride that once fueled him became his prison. He refused to take on small jobs, scoffed at opportunities, and spiraled further into debt. Claire grew restless, her contempt for him growing by the day. What she wanted was quick wealth, not the grind of proving oneself. Their marriage began to crack under the weight of my conditions. But David, my son, had a spark deep inside. Beneath the arrogance and pride, there was still the boy who once sat in my lap, asking how I built my first business. That boy resurfaced when the weight of the world forced him to face reality. Slowly, he began to change. He picked up projects, learned skills he had ignored, and worked longer hours than ever before. His clothes lost their shine, but his eyes began to hold a different kind of light. One of determination, not pride. By the 10th month, David stood before Mr. Hamilton with something he never thought he could create: a small but thriving consultancy business. He had no Claire by his side anymore. She had left months earlier when the money didn't come easily. But in her absence, David had found something far more valuable than wealth. He had found himself. When Mr. Hamilton opened the trust and revealed the fortune waiting for him, David didn't smirk or boast. He simply cried. He whispered, "I was wrong about him. Dad knew me better than I knew myself." And in that moment, even though I was no longer alive to see it, I knew my son finally understood. It was never about the money. It was about the man he needed to become. So the will reading didn't just leave David speechless, left him reborn. Sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give isn't wealth. It's wisdom disguised as hardship. And my son, my pride, finally received it.